There are days when fate doesn't knock on the door, but tears are lives apart. Eleanor Grant experienced that exact moment when she stepped off a stagecoach in the Wild West and discovered that the man who promised to marry her had passed away. All plans, all hopes, all vanished in a breath. But then, the brother of the deceased, a quiet, wounded cowboy, stepped forward to offer to fulfill that unfinished promise. Between two seemingly wrong choices, returning to loneliness or staying with a stranger with a heart full of darkness, which would you choose if it were you? When all doors closed, would you have the courage to stay for the slightest ray of hope? Do you dare to believe that sometimes loss is not the end, but a turning point that leads us to things we never dared to dream of? Please join us in the story. To listen, to see yourself somewhere in Eleanor's adversity. And before we begin, if you feel any vibrations, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we don't lose each other in the next stories. The stagecoach rolled into Dry Creek just as the late afternoon wind swept down from the ridges, carrying dust the color of burnt wheat. Eleanor Grant pressed her gloved hands against her skirt, steadying herself while the coach wheels groaned to a halt. After 3 long days on the road, days of rattling wooden benches, thin meals, and the endless ache of uncertainty, she finally stood at the edge of the place she hoped might become home. She stepped down carefully, her boots touching the dusty ground of the Wyoming Territory for the first time. The plains stretched wide and silent beyond the cluster of wooden buildings, their shingled roofs glinting beneath the sun. A chill brushed her neck despite the warm air. She was far away from everything familiar from her old classroom in Ohio, from her late husband's memory, from the life that had slowly crumbled behind her. But she had come here with hope. Fragile as a dried leaf, but still intact. She expected to see a man waiting, a man with a gentle smile, a man who had written to her for 10 months with steady, thoughtful words, words that felt like a rope thrown across the emptiness of her life. Anthony Grant. Her intended. The man whose letters had given her courage to leave everything she knew. But no such man came forward. The passengers dispersed around her. A ranch hand stacked crates near the general store. A young mother hushed her baby as she hurried across the street. A couple of boys chased a stray dog behind the livery stable. No one stepped toward her. No one called her name. A tightness grew in her chest. She reached for her carpet bag, trying to look composed, though her heart had begun a quiet, frantic knocking beneath her ribs. Then she heard boots, slow, heavy, measured. "Ma'am." She turned. A tall man stood a few yards away, hat in hand, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, dust streaking the front of his vest. He looked older than she expected, older than Anthony. Certainly. His face was carved with sun lines and a kind of tiredness she recognized instantly. A tiredness born from long seasons of work and longer seasons of silence. His eyes, a deep brown touched with storm gray, held something that made her stomach drop. Not welcome, not curiosity, grief. "Are you Miss Eleanor Grant?" he asked. Her breath hitched. Yes, I am. And you must be Anthony." She already knew the answer. Something in the man's voice told her before he spoke. "I'm Wesley Grant," he said quietly. "Anthony's older brother." The world tilted. Wesley looked down at his hat as if searching for steadier ground than she felt beneath her feet. When he lifted his eyes again, they were solemn, almost apologetic. "Miss Grant, I'm afraid I bring you hard news." A single gust of wind swept between them, scattering dust across the road like ash. "Anthony passed 11 days ago." The words hung suspended in the air, nearly impossible to grasp. Eleanor's hand tightened around the handle of her bag. "No," she whispered. "That can't be. I received his last letter just a month ago. He said he was well planning. planning for my arrival. Wesley's throat worked before he spoke. He was, and he wanted nothing more than to meet you. But he took ill late in the winter, and he hid it from near everyone. Stubborn fool. Wesley breathed, shaking his head with a mixture of anger and affection. He didn't make it. Her vision blurred at the edges. The small, dusty world of Dry Creek softened like a watercolor under rain. Eleanor lifted a trembling hand to her chest. I came all this way. I know. Wesley's voice dropped even lower. And I'm sorry you had to hear it this way. The coach behind her creaked as the driver unloaded luggage, oblivious to the quiet devastation unfolding at the station. Eleanor felt betrayed by distance, by time, by fate itself. She had crossed plains and rivers and miles of loneliness for a man who no longer existed. She felt foolish, small, bereaved for someone she had never actually met but had known through paper and ink better than most people she saw every day. Her breath trembled. I don't understand, she murmured. Why didn't anyone send word? Wesley looked away, jaw tightening. Your last letter arrived after we buried him. I didn't know what you would want me to do, and by the time I could have sent a message, the coach was already on its way west. Miss Grant. There was no time. He reached into his vest slowly, as though handling something fragile. Anthony left this in his room. He must have kept it close. Wesley held out a handkerchief well-worn cotton, edges embroidered with neat blue thread, her initials, E.G. Anthony had stitched her initials with the uneven patience of a cowboy learning a new skill for someone who mattered. Eleanor took it with both hands. A soft gasp escaped her as her fingers closed around the cloth. Her world fractured quietly, painfully, the kind of break that didn't scatter loudly but sank deep into the ribs. For a moment, nobody spoke. Wind pressed against the empty road. A screen door slammed somewhere down the street. A horse snorted from the hitching post. Wesley cleared his throat gently. There's a room waiting for you at Dawson's boarding house. Miss Clara Dawson knows you're coming. It's not much, but it's warm, and she's the kindest woman in town. I'll take you there if you'd like. Eleanor swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. Is there anything I should do? Papers arrangements. You don't owe anything, Wesley said, soft but firm. Anthony wanted you to come here because he believed in giving you a new start. His words, not mine. That was when her knees wavered, not from weakness, but from the awful tenderness of it. Anthony's absence pressed like a shadow between them, but his intentions, his hopes, were still lingering in this place. Wesley watched her carefully, respectfully. He looked like a man who knew grief well enough to recognize it in someone else. Miss Grant, you're not alone, he said gently. Not here. For reasons she couldn't name, Eleanor believed him. Not because he said it with warmth, but because he said it with sincerity. And sincerity was something she had always trusted more than charm. Wesley offered his hand to carry her bag. She hesitated, then allowed it, feeling the strange, steady assurance in his grip. She followed him toward the waiting wagon, her boots sinking slightly into the dry earth. As she climbed into the seat, she looked back once at the station, hoping foolishly that she might still see a figure stepping toward her. There was no one, just the ceaseless wind, carrying the first threads of a life she hadn't expected to face. Eleanor drew in a long breath, tasting dust, sun, and uncertainty. Her new beginning had arrived dressed as loss, and though she didn't yet know it, the man sitting beside her, silent, steady, Wesley Grant would become the unexpected turning point of everything that came after. The wagon wheels creaked softly as they rolled away from the station, leaving the quiet heart of Dry Creek behind. Eleanor sat beside Wesley, her hands folded carefully in her lap. She watched the wooden storefronts drift past like pieces of a life she was not yet part of. Every house had a slanted porch. Every yard seemed guarded by an old wagon wheel or a stack of chopped firewood. She tried to take it all in, though her thoughts kept circling the news she had just learned. Wesley held the reins with a steady grip. His posture was firm, but there was something thoughtful in the way he guided the horses, giving them time to settle after the long wait at the station. He did not speak. He simply let the silence lie between them like a blanket neither wished to disturb. Eleanor found herself grateful for that. Words felt too sharp still. After a while, the buildings thinned, replaced by open fields, fences stretching into rolling grassland, and cottonwood trees bending gently under the expanse of sky. The land felt both lonely and comforting, as though it carried the weight of many unspoken stories. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice softer than she expected. "Does the town always feel this quiet?" Wesley kept his gaze on the trail. "Most days." "Yes. Folks out here work sunup to sundown. The noise comes from the wind and the cattle more than people." He paused briefly, considering his next words. "Quiet has its own way of teaching you things." His tone held no boast or regret. It was simply truth, shaped by years of living with wide skies and long distances. Eleanor wondered how many of those quiet days he had spent alone on horseback, or out fixing fences in bitter wind. Men like Wesley lived in a rhythm she was only beginning to understand. The wagon turned onto a narrow dirt road. Ahead, she saw a set of buildings resting near a cluster of low hills. A small house stood nearest the road, white paint faded by seasons of sun. Beyond it sprawled a larger ranch house with a deep porch, smoke drifting lazily from its chimney. A line of barns and corrals stretched behind the house, filled with the shapes of horses and cattle moving slowly in the late-day light. "That is the Grant Ranch," Wesley said. "Family land since my grandfather came up from Missouri." Eleanor nodded quietly. The land was beautiful in a stern, demanding way. She felt its expectation. This was not a place that welcomed weakness. It respected those who endured. Before reaching the main house, Wesley guided the wagon toward a smaller cabin standing apart from the rest. It was set beside a young cottonwood tree, its branches trembling. The cabin was unfinished at the edges. The wood around the door was freshly cut, and the roof shingles looked newer than the ones on the main building. Wesley stopped the wagon. "This is where you will stay for now. My brother began fixing it earlier in the spring. He meant it to be livable by the time you arrived." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She studied the cabin more closely. The doorframe had been sanded smooth by careful hands. The porch had 3 steps, still showing the pale color of unweathered wood. She saw a window on the right side, its frame newly painted. A wooden table sat on the small porch, as though waiting for someone to place flowers or a lantern there. It was the beginning of a home intended for her and Anthony. Wesley climbed down and offered his hand. She hesitated only a moment before accepting his help. His palm was calloused, warm, and surprisingly gentle. Once her feet touched the ground, she stepped slowly toward the porch. The air smelled of pine sap and a faint scent of smoke from the ranch house chimney. She heard the distant call of cattle lowing in the pasture. Wesley carried her carpetbag and set it beside the door. "You can open it," he said, stepping back to give her space. Eleanor pushed the door gently. It swung inward with a soft creak. Light spilled into the single-room cabin, revealing a space both spare and hopeful. There was a bed frame against the far wall, a small cast-iron stove, and a wooden table beside a narrow bookshelf. Most of the shelves were empty, but one held a few volumes, a collection of poetry, a worn Bible, a book of local plants, all carefully arranged. Her gaze drifted to a corner where she saw a stack of lumber and a hammer resting beside it. Anthony had been preparing to finish the walls. A wave of ache swept through her, sudden and sharp. She touched the edge of the table, grounding herself against the tide of emotion. Anthony chose this place because it's close to the main house but still quiet, Wesley said behind her. He wanted you to have space to make it yours. Eleanor closed her eyes. She pictured Anthony hunched over a plank of wood, sanding the edges with patient strokes. She imagined him pausing to look out the window, thinking of the woman he had been writing to, hoping he was building the right kind of life for her. The thought reached deep inside her, like a hand brushing against an unhealed wound, when she turned. Wesley stood just inside the doorway, hat held against his chest. He did not intrude further. His presence was respectful, almost protective. She sensed that he had come to understand grief not through words, but through living beside it for years. "If you need anything," he said quietly, "I'll be at the ranch. Supper is in about an hour. You're welcome to join us, though you do not have to if you'd rather rest." Eleanor nodded, unable to trust her voice for a moment. She watched him step out into the soft evening light. Before he left the porch, he paused. "There is something you should know," he said. His tone was gentler than before, edged with something unspoken. "My brother thought highly of you. He spoke of you as though he already knew the shape of your heart." Her breath caught. How do you know that Wesley looked toward the distant hills? The fading sun cast a warm glow over his features. Because he talked about hope. And Anthony did not talk about hope unless someone gave him reason to. Then he tipped his hat, walked back to the wagon, and guided the horses toward the main house, leaving Eleanor standing at the door of the life she had never expected. For a long moment, she remained still, listening to the cabin settle around her. The room held the faint smell of cut wood and dust, as if it had been waiting silently for someone to breathe life into it. She walked to the window and placed her fingertips against the glass. The ranch sprawled in quiet resilience beyond the cabin, its order shaped by years of labor. She could hear distant voices, the soft call of ranch hands finishing their work, the rhythmic clatter of tools being put away. Eleanor let her thoughts unravel slowly. She had come seeking a future. She had found loss instead. Yet beneath the pain, she sensed something else, elusive but present, a stillness that did not feel empty, a possibility small as a seed buried in winter soil. She exhaled, releasing a breath she felt she had been holding since the moment Wesley spoke Anthony's name. She whispered to the quiet room, "I do not know what I am meant to do now." The silence received her words gently, as though the cabin itself understood uncertainty. The place felt neither foreign nor familiar. It felt suspended, waiting for a story to be written inside its walls. And for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Eleanor felt the faintest trace of steadiness return. Perhaps beginnings did not always arrive with joy. Sometimes they stepped forward wrapped in sorrow, asking for patience rather than celebration. As the sun lowered and shadows lengthened across the plains, Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched the ranch lights flicker to life. A lantern glowed near the barn. Another shone from the porch of the main house. She could hear the distant ring of a dinner bell. She did not know what tomorrow held, but she felt, somewhere deep within, that this land had room for healing. She gathered her courage and stepped into the evening, heading toward the warm light of the Grant Ranch. The path toward the Grant Ranch house was soft with evening dust. As Eleanor walked, the faint warmth of lantern light pooled across the porch boards, welcoming in a quiet, unassuming way. She could hear voices inside, low and steady, the kind of sounds that came from people who had lived and worked together for years. The air carried the scent of roasted meat and fresh cornbread. Hunger brushed her lightly, though she was not sure if it came from her stomach or from the ache of needing connection after such an unraveling day. When she stepped onto the porch, she paused, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. She was not a woman prone to fear, yet tonight her heart moved cautiously, like a deer testing the ground after winter. Stepping into a home she was never meant to enter felt strangely intimate. Before she could gather her courage, the front door opened. Clara Dawson stood there with flowers still dusting her apron. She was a large-hearted woman with soft eyes and a voice that carried kindness the way a quilt carried warmth. "You must be Eleanor," Clara said gently. "Come in, dear. We've been waiting for you." Eleanor let herself be guided inside the glow of the ranch house. The room held a long wooden table worn smooth by years of use. Two young ranch hands were washing up at a basin in the corner. Wesley stood near the fireplace, speaking quietly with an older man whose hair had silvered at the temples. The moment Eleanor stepped inside, the conversation softened and eyes lifted toward her. Wesley approached first. He did not smile, not quite, but there was a subtle ease in his expression, a reassurance offered without words. "Glad you made it," he said. "Supper is ready." Clara ushered Eleanor to a seat near the center of the table. A platter of roast venison rested beside a bowl of mashed potatoes whipped smooth with butter. Stewed beans simmered gently, giving off a hearty aroma. The food looked humble yet comforting, built from the land itself. As everyone took their places, Wesley bowed his head. "We give thanks," he said simply. The table lowered into quiet reverence. Eleanor bowed her head as well, though her thoughts reached for more than gratitude. She felt the weight of loss settling once again at the edges of her awareness. A chair at the far end of the table was empty. She wondered if that had been Anthony's place. The thought touched her like a cold fingertip. When the meal began, conversation rose softly. The older man, introduced as Thomas Delaney, a longtime foreman of the ranch, told a story about fixing a fence line that had blown down the day before. The ranch hands added comments about a stubborn mare that had refused the saddle earlier in the morning. The room filled with an easy rhythm, the kind that could only exist among people who trusted one another. Eleanor listened more than she spoke, taking in the cadence of their voices and the gentle camaraderie. She felt a slight warmth spreading in her chest. Something small but steady. It was the warmth of belonging, or perhaps the very beginning of it. Wesley served her a portion of venison, then passed the bowl of potatoes her way. "If you need more, just say so," he said quietly. "Thank you," she replied, grateful for his calm presence. She noticed the careful distance he maintained, as though he did not want to overwhelm her, yet remained aware of her needs. It was a kind of respect she had not expected. After a few minutes, Clara leaned closer. "Your cabin suits you, I hope. Anthony talked a great deal about how he wanted it to be comfortable for you. He'd been working far later into the evenings than usual." Eleanor felt a twinge of emotion and lowered her gaze. He was thoughtful. She whispered, "More than I ever deserved?" Clara's eyes softened. "Oh, dear. Don't say that. You gave him something to look forward to. Out here, hope is worth more than gold." Across the table, Wesley's hand stilled for a moment. His gaze lowered, and Eleanor sensed there was more he wished to say but did not. A quiet shadow passed across his features. She wondered if the mention of his brother still tugged at him in the same sharp way grief tugged at her. As the plates emptied, the conversation drifted to memories of past seasons, stories of storms survived and harvests nearly lost. Eleanor found herself gradually relaxing, the warmth of the room settling into her bones. Yet a part of her remained distant, as though a thin pane of glass separated her from everyone else. She felt herself wanting to reach across it, but not knowing how. Thomas Delaney eventually pushed back from the table. "Tomorrow's a full day," he said. "Cattle in the north pasture need moving. Best get rest while there's quiet." The ranch hands rose as well, offering Eleanor small nods before stepping out into the night. Clara began clearing plates, humming lightly. Wesley stood from his chair, gathering a few dishes for the sink. "You don't need to do that," Clara said, swatting gently at his arm. "I've got it under control." Wesley offered a faint smile. Old habits. Eleanor rose slowly, not wanting to seem ungrateful or unsure. "I can help, if you like," she offered. Clara shook her head. "Not tonight. Your first hours here have been heavy enough. Rest is what you need." Eleanor hesitated, then thanked her softly. She turned toward the door, sensing Wesley fall into step beside her. Outside, the night had deepened into a cool blue. Stars began spilling across the sky with the kind of clarity only the open plains could offer. The air smelled of sagebrush and the faint sweetness of hay stored in the barn. Wesley walked her halfway down the path toward the cabin. They moved without speaking for several paces, the soft crunch of gravel beneath their boots the only sound. The silence felt different now, no longer heavy, but thoughtful. At the small rise where the path curved, Eleanor paused to look at the horizon. The land stretched so far that the sky appeared almost endless. A sense of smallness washed through her, but it was not unpleasant. It reminded her that grief, no matter how deep, was only one part of a much wider world. Wesley stopped beside her. "I know today was more than anyone should bear," he said quietly, "but you held yourself with strength." Eleanor breathed slowly, absorbing his words. "I did not feel strong. Strength doesn't always look like feeling steady," he replied. "Sometimes it's just taking the next step, even when you're hurting." His voice carried the weight of someone who had walked many hard roads himself. She wondered how many losses he carried behind the quiet lines carved into his face. They reached the cabin porch. Eleanor rested her hand against the railing, feeling the smoothness Anthony had shaped. "This place is more than I expected," she murmured. Wesley nodded. "He wanted it to be a beginning for you both." The words hung between them. Tender, painful, true. Eleanor lifted her eyes to his. "Thank you for helping me tonight. I mean that." Wesley looked toward the lantern inside her cabin, then back at her. "You're not alone here. Eleanor, whatever you need, you'll have help." He tipped his hat and stepped back into the night, leaving her with the soft glow of the cabin waiting behind her. Eleanor entered the room and closed the door gently. She stood for a long moment, listening to the quiet heartbeat of the ranch beyond the thin walls. Inside her, emotions drifted like unsettled dust, but beneath them was a fragile thread of calm she had not expected. She removed her shawl and draped it over the chair, sitting on the edge of the bed frame. She breathed in deeply, letting everything settle the way the earth settled after a storm. Tonight had not healed her, but it had given her a foothold, and, for now, that was enough. Dawn slipped quietly across the plains, carrying a pale golden light that settled over the cabin walls. Eleanor woke before the sun had fully risen, stirred not by sound, but by the strange stillness of a place unfamiliar. The air in the room was cool, touched with the faint scent of pine from the unfinished beams above her. For a moment, she lay still, listening. No street noise, no church bells, only the distant call of a rooster and the faint rustle of wind threading through the cottonwood leaves outside. Her thoughts gathered slowly, reminding her of where she was and why she was here. Grief rose again, soft but persistent, pressing against her ribs with a hollow ache. She sat up and folded her hands in her lap. The memory of yesterday returned in fragments. The dusty station. Wesley's solemn eyes. The cabin, waiting for a future that would never come. It still felt unreal, like a dream she had not fully woken from. Yet morning light had a way of urging movement. She dressed quietly and smoothed her hair. Feeling the weight of choice settle on her shoulders, she could hide inside sorrow, letting it swallow every piece of her. Or she could take the next step, even if it trembled beneath her. When she opened the cabin door, cool air brushed her cheeks. The sun had just begun to rise, painting long, soft rays across the open land. In the distance, figures moved slowly around the barns. She recognized Thomas Delaney's broad frame and one of the ranch hands working beside him. The scent of coffee drifted faintly from the main house. She stepped down the porch, pausing as her boots settled into the soft earth. The land before her stretched wide and patient. It seemed to say that everything, even grief, could be held somewhere within this depth of space. As she walked toward the main house, Wesley emerged from the barn carrying a saddle over one shoulder. His shirt sleeves were rolled up again, revealing strong forearms dusted with early morning dirt. He looked as though he had been awake long before the first light touched the sky. He noticed her and slowed his steps. "Morning," he said, voice low from hours of work. "Hope the cabin treated you all right." "It did," Eleanor replied. "I slept better than I expected." Wesley nodded with a hint of approval. "Clara made breakfast. She said to bring you straight in." Eleanor felt a flicker of shyness. She was used to eating alone these past years. The thought of joining a table full of people still unsettled her, though last night's kindness lingered in her memory like a comforting ember. As they walked side by side toward the house, Wesley kept his pace easy, never rushing her. The distance held between them was careful, respectful. A silence stretched between them, but it felt natural, like part of the rhythm of this land. Inside, the kitchen was warm, filled with the aroma of biscuits and fresh eggs. Clara smiled the moment she saw Eleanor. "Good morning, dear. Sit. Let me get you a plate." Eleanor took a seat at the small kitchen table near the window. The morning light spilled across the wooden floorboards in soft, golden patches. Clara laid a plate before her, filled with scrambled eggs and a warm biscuit that steamed when she pulled it apart. Wesley poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned lightly against the counter. "We have a busy day," he said. "Cattle need moving before the weather shifts. If you'd like to see more of the ranch, you're welcome to come along, but only if you're feeling up to it." Eleanor hesitated. A part of her longed to hide inside the cabin, but another part, the part that had crossed hundreds of miles for a new beginning, felt drawn to see the land that was now her unplanned home. "I think I would like that," she said softly. Clara smiled as if hearing something hopeful in Eleanor's voice. "The fresh air will do you good." After breakfast, Eleanor walked with Wesley toward the north pasture. The path wound gently through tall grass that brushed against their boots. Horses grazed near the fence line, their coats shimmering under the rising sun. Eleanor paused to take in the view. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Wesley's gaze followed hers. "It's hard land, but it has a way of rewarding those who respect it." The words sounded like more than a simple observation. They felt like a quiet attempt to share something of himself. Eleanor let the moment settle, sensing there were pieces of Wesley she had not yet glimpsed. His calm demeanor, his steadiness, the way he seemed to understand unspoken pain, it all hinted at depths carved by experience. As they reached the pasture, Thomas Delaney waved them over. "Storm's building out west," he said. "We should move the herd while the ground's still firm." Eleanor watched the men work, each movement measured and practiced. The ranch hands guided the cattle with patient whistles and gentle gestures. Wesley rode ahead, his horse responding as though it could sense the direction without needing commands. There was grace in the way he moved, upright and steady in the saddle, the morning wind tugging at his shirt as he scanned the horizon. Eleanor found herself studying him, not out of curiosity alone, but from a growing sense of respect. Wesley worked with the land as though it were a partner rather than a burden. He reminded her of those who carried grief without letting it turn them hard. For a time, she helped Thomas gather stray calves along the fence. It was new work for her, but Thomas guided her with patient explanations. She found the tasks grounding. They quieted the restless places inside her. As the herd finally settled into the new pasture, Wesley rode back, reins loose in his hands. His horse slowed beside her. "You did well today," he said. "Most folks take a week to get used to ranch work, but you took to it quicker than expected." She felt a faint flush rise to her cheeks. "I'm not sure how much help I was." "You were present," he said. "That counts for more than you think." Eleanor absorbed the compliment quietly. Wesley did not offer praise lightly. His words felt honest, shaped by observation rather than kindness alone. A breeze swept across the pasture, carrying with it the first hint of cooler air. Cloud shadows stretched slowly across the hills. Eleanor felt the weight of the day settling into her bones. But it was a good weight, a steady one. When they finally headed back toward the ranch house, the sun was higher and the sky had cleared. Eleanor felt a calm she had not expected, a soft steadiness that came not from forgetting grief, but from moving through it. Wesley walked beside her again. After several quiet steps, he spoke. "Anthony would have been glad to see you here today." Eleanor stopped briefly, her breath catching. The mention of Anthony no longer cut sharply, but it still reached deep. "I hope I can honor what he wanted," she said. "You already have," Wesley replied. "You came. You stayed. That matters." She looked at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. His expression was unreadable but sincere. Something unspoken passed between them then. Not romantic, but human, born from shared understanding. When they reached the cabin, Wesley touched the brim of his hat. "Get some rest. The days here can be long." Eleanor opened the cabin door and turned back to him. "Thank you, Wesley, for today, for everything." He gave a small nod, then headed toward the ranch house. His steps were steady, but something about the way his shoulders lowered told her the day had carried its own heaviness for him as well. Inside the cabin. Eleanor sat by the window. The land outside glowed beneath the late morning sun. She placed her hand against the glass and let her thoughts settle. For the first time since arriving, she felt the faint beginning of belonging. Not fully formed, not certain, but present. She breathed deeply and closed her eyes. There was still sorrow, still confusion, still the ache of everything undone. But woven between these threads was a quiet pulse of possibility. The afternoon eased in slowly, bringing with it a hush that settled across the ranch. Eleanor rested for a short while inside the cabin, letting the stillness wrap around her like a soft shawl. When she stepped back outside, the sun had shifted lower, casting long strokes of amber light over the yard, somewhere in the distance. A windmill creaked gently, turning with a rhythm that matched the slow breathing of the land. She walked toward the main house with measured steps. Clara had invited her to supper, and though Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness, she also sensed a steadying pull toward the warmth of that kitchen. The door stood open just enough for voices to slip through. She paused on the porch, listening. Clara hummed softly. Thomas spoke in low tones from another room. Beneath it all, the quiet thud of Wesley's boots passed through the floorboards like the heartbeat of the home itself. When Eleanor stepped inside, Clara greeted her with a smile that felt like an anchor. Just in time. "Have a seat, dear." The table was small but welcoming. A pot of stew simmered on the stove. filling the room with the scent of slow-cooked beef and vegetables. A plate of warm cornbread sat nearby. Eleanor's stomach tightened at the reminder of how long it had been since she'd eaten anything hearty. Wesley entered from the other room, rubbing a hint of dust from his hands. His eyes shifted toward Eleanor, and something softened in his expression, almost as though her presence steadied him too. He took his seat without fanfare, and Clara ladled stew into each bowl. Conversation unfolded gently. Thomas spoke of the pastures, of how the winter had been drier than expected. Clara mentioned the hens finally laying again. Wesley offered a quiet observation about the fence on the north side needing repair. It was ordinary talk, simple and steady, but Eleanor felt herself leaning toward it like someone reaching for warmth after a long spell in the cold. She hadn't realized how starved she was for this. For company. For voices that didn't echo inside an empty boarding house room. For the soft, domestic rhythm that only comes from people who share their days. At one point, Clara glanced at Eleanor. "If you'd like to help around the house, dear, I'd welcome the company. There's no rush, just whenever you feel settled." Eleanor nodded. "I'd like that very much." Wesley looked up at her then, and the quiet approval in his eyes caused a strange warmth to bloom low in her chest. It startled her. She looked down at her bowl, letting the moment pass. After supper, Clara insisted Eleanor stay for coffee. The night outside darkened with a softness that came from clear skies and an early spring breeze. The ranch hands had finished their supper in the bunkhouse, leaving the main house quiet except for the soft scrape of chairs and the hiss of coffee poured into tin cups. Wesley sat at the far end of the table, his fingers wrapped loosely around his mug. Eleanor noticed he always seemed to hold things gently, even when his hands were worn by work. It was the same way he handled the horses, the same way he had guided her across the pasture earlier, firm, but never forceful. Barely aware she'd spoken aloud, she said, "It must take a great deal of patience to run a place this size." Wesley looked toward her, thoughtful. Patience, yes, and a willingness to face things as they come. The land doesn't bend just because we want it to. Clara smiled. He learned that from his father. That man believed storms were just another way the West tested your character. Eleanor sipped her coffee slowly. Back east, storms were something to hide from. Here they seem more personal. Wesley considered that. Everything is personal out here. The sky, the soil, the choices we make. Nothing stays far from who we are. His words struck something inside her. She felt a pang of understanding, painful and honest. Grief had followed her across states and prairies. It wasn't distant. It lived close. Yet something about the openness of this land made it feel less suffocating. Thomas rose after finishing his coffee. "I'll get the tools ready for tomorrow. Wesley, meet me at the barn first light." Wesley nodded. "I'll be there." Once Thomas left the room, the house grew quieter. Clara moved to tidy the dishes. Wesley stood as if to help, but Clara waved him off. "You've done enough work for one day. Go on." Wesley hesitated, then stepped outside, letting the screen door tap softly behind him. Eleanor remained seated, listening to the wind brush past the windows. Clara touched her shoulder gently. "Wesley's a good man, dear. Carries more weight than most men his age. He doesn't say much, but what he feels goes deep." Eleanor looked up, startled by the sudden intimacy of the words. "I don't want to be a burden to him." "You're not. He insisted you stay. That should tell you something." Eleanor lowered her gaze, her heart tightening with a mix of gratitude and unease. I don't want to step where I don't belong." Clara's smile held kindness threaded with understanding. Sometimes life puts us where we're meant to be, even when the path is painful. You don't owe anyone an apology for simply existing in the space you were invited into." Eleanor breathed out slowly, the truth of that landing gently inside her. When she stepped outside into the night, she found Wesley sitting on the porch steps. The moon hung low, casting pale light over his face. He glanced back at her but didn't stand. Instead, he shifted slightly to make room beside him. She took the offered space. They sat without speaking for several long moments. The night was alive with subtle sounds, the soft stir of leaves, the distant call of a coyote, the creak of the windmill turning with the breeze. Eleanor felt the heaviness of the day settle in her bones, but there was a quiet comfort in simply sitting near him. Finally, Wesley's voice broke the silence. "I'm glad you came along today. It's easier to face the work when there's someone nearby who understands the weight of being new to something." Eleanor folded her hands together. "I don't think I understand much, but I'm trying." "That's enough," he said gently. "Trying is more than most folks manage." The breeze picked up, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. Words pressed against her ribs, fragile and hesitant. "I didn't expect any of this. I thought I knew what I was coming to. I thought I knew who I would be with." Wesley didn't look at her, but his voice held a quiet ache. "I know." Eleanor swallowed. "And now everything feels different, unsteady, as though I stepped into a life that kept moving even without me." Wesley finally turned toward her, his expression shadowed but open. "The land doesn't wait for anyone. Neither does grief. But that doesn't mean you can't find your place here." His words were honest, not a comfort offered out of duty, but one born from experience. Eleanor felt the truth inside them like a slow, steady pulse. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When Wesley finally stood, he tipped his hat slightly. "Get some rest." "Eleanor, tomorrow's a new day." She watched him walk toward the barn, the moonlight catching the edges of his steps. Something in his posture told her he carried his own grief tucked deep inside, quiet but not forgotten. Eleanor returned to her cabin. She closed the door softly, leaning her back against the wood. For the first time since arriving, she let herself cry, but it was not only sorrow, it was release. It was the first crack in a wall she hadn't realized she'd built so high. And in that small, tender breaking, something inside her began to breathe again. Eleanor woke before dawn, stirred by a faint glow pressing through the thin curtains. For a moment she lay still, listening to the soft breaths of the prairie. The world outside her window held an almost sacred silence, that tender hour when night loosens its grip, but morning has yet to fully claim the land. She rose slowly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped barefoot onto the cool wooden floor. Her cabin felt different today, not changed in any visible way, but lighter somehow, as if last night's tears had washed a small window clean inside her, letting in a breath of something new. Hope, maybe, or simply the relief of being honest with herself. When she opened the door, the crisp morning air swept in, carrying the faint scent of dew settling over sage and dry earth. The sky stretched wide, pale shades of rose blending into soft streaks of gold. In the distance, she saw movement near the barn. Wesley and Thomas were already at work, their silhouettes shifting with quiet purpose as they prepared for the day's tasks. Eleanor hesitated. She knew she wasn't needed out there. The ranch had its own rhythm, and she was still learning her place within it. Yet something inside her urged her to step forward, to greet the day rather than hide from it. Clara waved when she stepped into the yard. She stood near the chicken coop, gathering eggs with a small wicker basket. "Morning, dear." "You're up early. I couldn't sleep," Eleanor admitted. The morning felt too still to stay inside. Clara's smile was warm and knowing. The West has a way of pulling folks out of bed before sunrise. There's something honest about seeing the day begin. Eleanor helped Clara carry the eggs inside, placing them gently into a small bowl on the counter. Clara glanced at her, her tone soft. "You're settling in better than you think." "I'm trying," Eleanor said quietly. "That's all any of us ever do." When Eleanor stepped back outside, Wesley was leading his horse from the barn. The mare's coat shimmered faintly in the new sunlight. Wesley paused when he saw her, his hand resting on the reins. "Morning," he said. His voice was calm, but something in his eyes flickered with surprise. Perhaps he didn't expect to see her awake so early. Perhaps he was glad she was. "Good morning," she replied, smoothing her shawl. "You're heading out to check the south pasture before the heat sets in." He adjusted the saddle, his movement steady and practiced. "Fence line's been acting up again. I didn't mean to interrupt. You're not—" He stepped closer, the space between them shifting into something gentle. "You're welcome to walk out a bit if you want. The morning's quiet." She considered the offer, her heart tightening slightly. "I don't want to slow your work." "You won't," he said simply. She followed him toward the edge of the yard, walking alongside him while he led the horse. There was no rush in his steps, no sense that her presence intruded. Instead, the quiet between them felt almost peaceful. They stopped near the gate. Wesley rested one hand on the saddle, studying the horizon as though reading something written only in the changing colors of the sky. "You slept, all right?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "Better than I expected." He nodded. Sometimes the hardest part of grief is letting yourself rest. Eleanor inhaled slowly. "I'm learning that." His eyes flicked toward her, warm yet cautious. "You don't have to learn everything alone." The softness of his words stirred something deep within her, a place she hadn't opened to anyone in a very long time. She looked down, suddenly unsure of the weight of the moment. Before she could respond, Thomas called from the barn. "Wesley, we need that gate checked today before the cattle wander off." Wesley turned slightly. "I'll be right there." He looked back at Eleanor, and for a brief second their eyes held in a shared understanding neither dared name. Then he mounted his horse with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. "You need anything," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "You know where to find me." He guided the horse toward the open field, leaving Eleanor standing by the gate. She watched him ride out, his silhouette growing smaller against the brightening sky. Part of her felt drawn after him, as though some invisible cord stretched between them. But another part warned her to move slowly, with caution, with respect for the delicate balance of their circumstances. She returned to the cabin to gather her things for the day. Clara had asked her to help clean the pantry and sort through old supplies. A simple task, but Eleanor welcomed the distraction. She needed something steady to occupy her thoughts. The morning passed peacefully. Eleanor sorted jars, wiped shelves, and helped Clara prepare vegetables for preserving. The kitchen filled with soft chatter, the kind that asked little and gave much. Clara spoke of her childhood near St. Louis, of days when the river had risen so high her family had to stack furniture atop crates. Eleanor listened, grateful for the stories that filled the small spaces between their work. Near noon, Clara paused, eyeing her gently. "Wesley seems lighter today." Eleanor stilled. "Does he—" "Yes. He's always been steady, but this morning there was something different about him, as if he's breathing a little easier." "I don't know what would cause that," Eleanor murmured. Clara smiled knowingly. Sometimes the simple presence of another heart can shift the entire weight a person carries. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "I don't want to cause trouble." You're not. Clara placed a hand softly on her arm. Just let things unfold at their own pace. Later, Eleanor stepped outside for fresh air. The sun hung high now, warming the packed earth beneath her feet. She walked toward the small garden behind the main house. The soil there was rich and dark, the sprouts just beginning to push through. She knelt, pressing her fingers into the warm earth, and for the first time since leaving her former life, she felt grounded. The sound of hooves approached. When Eleanor looked up, Wesley was dismounting near the barn, dust clinging to his boots and sleeves. He wiped his brow, exhaling after a long ride. Their eyes met across the yard, and a quiet understanding passed between them. He walked closer, stopping a few feet away. "Fence is holding now," he said. "I'm glad," she replied softly. He studied her kneeling near the garden, an unreadable expression flickering across his face. "You look like you belong there," he murmured. Eleanor blinked. "I've never been much of a gardener. You don't have to be. You just look settled." She opened her mouth, but words faltered. Instead, she let a small breath escape. "I'm trying to find where I fit." "That's all anyone does out here," Wesley said, "and fitting in has less to do with knowing things, more to do with feeling them." He knelt beside her, the earth shifting slightly under their combined weight. Their shoulders brushed, light as a breath. Eleanor stilled, the warmth of the contact lingering long after. Wesley pressed his hand into the soil. "This land teaches you patience, teaches you how to stay, teaches you how to grow roots even when you think you've got none left." Eleanor swallowed, her voice quiet. "And if you're afraid of putting down roots again," he looked at her, steady and sincere, "then you start with something small, something that doesn't demand answers, something simple, like helping Clara, or planting a seed." A soft breeze brushed past them, rustling the leaves. Eleanor felt her breath catch. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered. "You don't have to," he replied. When he rose to leave, he paused, offering his hand to help her stand. She placed her palm against his, the contact sending a faint tremor through her chest. Wesley lifted her gently, their eyes meeting with an understanding that neither could yet name. He stepped back slowly. "Dinner will be ready soon." "I'll be there." Wesley nodded once before heading toward the barn. Eleanor watched him go, feeling something shift within her, quiet but undeniably real, a beginning, a possibility, a fragile opening in a heart she thought had closed forever. The evening drifted in with a hush, the kind that wrapped itself around the ranch like a soft wool blanket. Eleanor lingered near the garden long after Wesley returned to the barn. She traced the edges of the young sprouts with her fingertips, as though touching the soil might steady her thoughts. A warmth fluttered in her chest, gentle but insistent, something she wasn't ready to name. The sun slipped lower, casting long amber trails across the ground. A pair of horses grazed beyond the fence, their tails flicking lazily at the settling dusk. The world felt calm, almost tender. Yet, inside her, a quiet storm gathered, made of questions she was afraid to voice. Clara called her in when the sky deepened to violet. Supper smelled of roasted chicken and fresh biscuits. The lamps flickered softly, throwing warm circles across the table. Eleanor took her seat beside Clara, while Thomas and Wesley settled across from them. The conversation was light at first, but a shift happened whenever Wesley glanced up. His eyes met Eleanor's for the barest moment, and every time it happened, something inside her steadied and trembled at once. Clara noticed, of course. The woman noticed everything, but she said nothing, choosing instead to guide the meal with gentle talk of livestock and garden plans. After supper, Thomas stepped out to check the tack shed, and Clara excused herself to finish a basket of mending. Eleanor stood uncertainly at the doorway, unsure whether to remain or retreat to her cabin. Wesley leaned against the edge of the kitchen counter, arms crossed loosely. The lamplight caught on the worn fabric of his shirt and the faint smudge of dust still clinging to his jaw. He watched her with an expression that carried neither expectation nor distance, only a quiet, steady awareness. "You look like you've got more on your mind than you want to say," he murmured. Eleanor toyed with the edge of her shawl. "I'm still learning my way. Sometimes the quiet makes it easier to think. Sometimes it makes everything louder." Wesley nodded. "Silence can do both. Depends on what you're carrying." She let out a slow breath. "I thought I knew what my life would be. Then it shifted so suddenly. I feel as though I've been walking through someone else's footsteps, like the road wasn't meant for me at all." He stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough that she felt the warmth of him. "Then maybe it's time you start making your own road." She looked up at him, and what if I'm afraid Wesley's voice grew softer. Being afraid doesn't mean you're lost. It just means what's ahead matters. The words settled deep within her. She could feel their weight, steady and patient, like the land itself. Before she could speak again, a knock sounded at the front door. Quick, uneven, urgent. Wesley straightened immediately. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten as he crossed the room and pulled the door open. Sheriff Alden stood on the porch, his hat in hand, dust streaking his coat as though he'd ridden hard to reach them. "Evening." "Grant," the sheriff said. "I hate to bring trouble this way, but I thought you should hear this from me." Wesley's expression sharpened. "What's happened?" Sheriff Alden stepped inside, casting a wary glance toward Eleanor before continuing. "It's about Isaac." A chill passed through Eleanor, sharper than the night air. Clara appeared from the hallway, her sewing forgotten. Thomas stepped in through the back door, freezing the moment he heard Isaac's name. Eleanor's voice trembled. "What about him?" The sheriff cleared his throat. "A man passing through Black Ridge claimed he saw someone who looked exactly like Isaac 3 days ago. Said the fellow was alive, walking, talking, buying supplies. Figured he must have mistaken him for someone else. But..." He hesitated. He described the scar on Isaac's temple, the one he got breaking a wild gelding a few years back. Clara clasped her hand over her mouth. Thomas swore under his breath. Wesley remained utterly still, though his jaw tightened. Eleanor felt the room tilt. "That's impossible," she whispered. "The letters, the announcement. You all said..." "We believed he was dead," the sheriff said gently. "No one had seen him since the river storm. Horse came back without him. Folks assumed the worst." Thomas stepped forward. "Why wouldn't he let us know he survived?" Wesley's voice was low, rough. "Because something isn't right." The sheriff nodded. "I'll send word if I hear more, but I thought the family should know first, just in case." He tipped his hat and left, his footsteps fading into the dark. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything Eleanor had ever known. It settled into the cracks of the house, into the spaces between their breaths. Clara was the first to move. She touched Eleanor's arm gently. "Dear, you should sit." But Eleanor stepped back. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "If he's alive, then everything I've agreed to, everything I've begun to feel." Her voice broke. "I don't know where I stand anymore." Wesley's eyes met hers with a depth that nearly undid her, not because of the confusion in them, but because of the quiet ache she sensed beneath it. "We don't know the truth yet," he said softly. "We only know rumors. But rumors can tremble a life apart just as easily as truth," she whispered. Clara looked between them with sorrowful understanding. You both should take a moment. This is a lot to carry." Eleanor needed air. She stepped outside, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the fence line. The night had cooled, the moon rising slowly over the prairie. Crickets filled the silence with their steady song. Wesley followed after a minute, his footsteps careful. He stopped a few feet behind her, giving her space. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She shook her head. "You've done nothing wrong. I brought you here. I offered you a place. And now—" He exhaled. The sound tinged with something she recognized too well. Pain held tight beneath control. "Now everything's uncertain." Eleanor turned toward him. "Not because of you." His eyes held hers, steady and searching. "But it affects you. And that matters to me." Her breath caught. The truth of it shimmered between them, fragile and bright. Eleanor looked toward the horizon. If Isaac is alive, then why hasn't he come home? Wesley's voice was heavy. If he survived that storm and didn't send word, then either something happened to him after, or he chose not to return. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. And if he chose not to, what does that mean for everything I believed? Wesley stepped closer. The faint crunch of gravel marking each quiet step. It means the truth isn't what you were told, and you're allowed to feel the weight of that. She blinked back tears. "I don't want to be someone's obligation. Wesley, not yours, not his." Wesley's voice softened, threaded with emotion he rarely let through. "You're not to me." The admission struck deep. She turned to him fully, the moonlight catching the conflicted tenderness in his eyes. "Then what am I to you?" she whispered. His breath hitched. For a moment, it seemed as though he might speak the words forming on his lips. But instead he closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself. "You're someone I want to protect," he said finally. "Someone whose presence changes the shape of my days." Eleanor felt her heart tremble, a fragile ache of longing and fear. "But until we know the truth about Isaac," he continued quietly, "we can't step toward anything else. Not without hurting you, or dishonoring what you were promised." She swallowed hard. "I understand." The night pressed closer, full of unsaid words. Wesley's gaze lingered on her, torn between restraint and something deeper. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "you won't face it alone." Eleanor nodded, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." They stood there in the moonlit quiet, the earth holding its breath beneath their feet. Somewhere beyond the hills, truth waited, and when it came, it would change everything. The morning arrived, shrouded in a muted hush, as though the land itself sensed the weight of the questions left hanging in the dark. Eleanor barely slept. Her thoughts had churned quietly through the night, spinning between dread and a fragile thread of hope she didn't want to examine too closely. When dawn finally pushed its pale light across the sky, she rose with a heaviness she carried more in her chest than her limbs. Outside, a cool breeze swept across the yard. The sun had yet to rise above the distant hills, leaving the ranch washed in soft gray light. Eleanor found herself staring toward the barn without meaning to. She wondered if Wesley had rested at all, or if the same restless questions had kept him awake. She stepped onto the packed earth, her boots crunching lightly. Wesley emerged from the barn just as she approached. He lifted his gaze, his expression steady but shadowed. There was something in the way he looked at her that felt both grounding and unsteadying at once. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning." She answered, her voice catching slightly. Thomas joined them a moment later, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. "Sheriff sent word," he announced. "The traveler who claimed to see Isaac is still in Black Ridge, Alden wants us to meet him. Wesley nodded. I figured we'd have to hear the story ourselves. Thomas looked between them. We can ride out after breakfast. Eleanor felt the slightest tremor beneath her ribs. I'd like to come as well. Wesley frowned gently. It might be better if you stay here. We don't know what we'll be walking into. I understand, she said, steadying her breath. But if Isaac truly was seen, then this concerns me too. Wesley held her gaze for a long moment, conflict flickering beneath his calm exterior. Thomas cleared his throat softly. It's her right. Wes? Wesley exhaled slowly. All right, but you ride close to me. Eleanor nodded, her palms damp despite the morning chill. Inside, Clara had breakfast waiting warm biscuits, thick slices of ham, and coffee strong enough to brace the nerves. She studied each of them as they entered, her keen eyes reading the tension without a word. You'll be careful, she said, her voice gentle but firm. It was not a question. Wesley rested a hand on her shoulder in silent reassurance. We always are. Clara touched Eleanor's sleeve. Take a shawl, dear. Mornings near the ridge can bite through even a brave heart. Eleanor managed a small smile. Thank you. When they finished eating, the three of them prepared the horses. Eleanor's mount was a calm chestnut mare named Willow, patient and steady beneath her hands. Wesley checked the saddle twice, adjusting the straps with meticulous care. You sure you're ready for this? He murmured. I need to know the truth, she whispered back. Wesley nodded faintly. Then we'll face it together. They rode out in silence, the morning air cool against their faces. The grass swayed gently beneath the hooves, each step echoing in Eleanor's chest. The land stretched endlessly before them, open and vast, a reminder of how tiny their fears felt against such an expanse and yet how heavy they were to carry. The trail wound toward Black Ridge, a small settlement nestled between two sloping hills. As they rode, Eleanor felt the tension building inside her, growing heavier with every mile. Her thoughts drifted between memories of Isaac's letters, the promises she once believed unshakable, and the quiet understanding that had begun to form between her and Wesley. She didn't know what frightened her more, the possibility that Isaac truly lived, or the possibility that he didn't. Wesley rode slightly ahead, his shoulders taut. Thomas followed close behind. At times Wesley glanced back at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a depth she struggled to interpret. Concern, certainly, but also something quieter, more guarded, something he held at arm's length out of honor or caution. Black Ridge appeared on the horizon near midday. A cluster of wooden storefronts lined a dusty street, smoke curling from chimneys. They slowed their horses as they approached the sheriff's office, where Alden waited with his arms crossed. The sheriff stepped forward. Glad you came. The man's inside. Says he'll talk. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Her fingers tightened on the reins. Wesley dismounted and helped her down with a care that was almost painful in its gentleness. His hand lingered near hers for a breath before he stepped back. Inside the office, a traveler sat near the desk, middle-aged, with wind-chapped skin and a sun-faded coat. He looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to something more uneasy when he noticed Eleanor. Alden introduced them. This here's Mrs. Eleanor Grant, Isaac's fiancée. The man's eyes widened slightly. Ma'am. Eleanor nodded politely, her throat dry. You said you saw someone who looked like Isaac. The man shifted. I did. 3 days ago, in Clearwater Junction. Wesley frowned. Clearwater's nearly 2 days from here by horse. Aye, the man replied. I was passing through on my way north, stopped at the feed store, saw a fellow stepping out from behind it, looked like he'd been sleeping rough. Thomas leaned in. You're certain it was Isaac? as certain as a man can be with someone he met only once. The traveler scratched his jaw. Same face, same height, and that scar on the left temple. Hard thing to forget. Eleanor felt her heart pound. Did he speak? Did he seem hurt? He kept to himself, looked over his shoulder a lot, carried a small pack, like someone who didn't want attention. Eleanor swallowed hard. Did he see you? I reckon he did, and he left quick afterward. The room fell silent. Wesley's jaw worked as he processed the information. Why wouldn't he come home? The traveler shrugged helplessly. Can't say, but he was alive. That much I know. Eleanor's legs wavered. She steadied herself on the edge of the desk. Wesley moved closer instinctively, not touching her, but close enough she felt the reassurance of his presence. Alden cleared his throat. There's more. Wesley's eyes narrowed. Go on. Got word last night that Clearwater's marshal found a torn piece of a coat near the river crossing. Looked like it had been cut clean through, and there were tracks nearby. Signs of a struggle. Eleanor's breath caught, so he might be hurt or taken. Possibly, Alden admitted. We don't know who was involved or what happened. Wesley's entire stance shifted, shoulders squared, gaze sharpened, resolve forming like iron. Then we'll ride to Clearwater. Alden raised a hand. It's dangerous country out that way. Bandits have been spotted along the Ridge Trail. We're not turning back, Wesley said. Thomas nodded firmly. Isaac may be in trouble. Eleanor lifted her chin, voice trembling but steady. And if he is, I won't abandon him. Wesley looked at her then, and the battle in his eyes was unmistakable. A mixture of loyalty, fear for her safety, and something deeper he didn't dare name. You shouldn't come to Clearwater, he murmured. Eleanor stepped closer. I have to. His breath faltered. Eleanor, I won't sit here wondering if he's alive or dying. The pain in Wesley's eyes tightened like a knot. Then I'll keep you safe, whatever we find. The sheriff gave instructions, but Eleanor barely heard them. Her thoughts spiraled in quiet, aching circles. Isaac alive. Isaac missing. Isaac possibly choosing not to return. And Wesley standing at her side with a loyalty she didn't deserve, bound by honor and a tenderness he tried to bury beneath duty. When they stepped back outside, the sun had climbed high, illuminating the dust that drifted lazily across the road. Eleanor breathed in deeply, steadying herself. Wesley approached her horse and offered his hand to help her mount. She hesitated only a moment before placing her palm against his. His fingers closed around hers. Warm and sure. Whatever comes next, he said quietly, we'll face it. That promise settled deep within her, a fragile thread of strength she didn't know she needed until now. They rode out of Black Ridge toward Clearwater Junction, the horizon wide and uncertain before them, the road carrying both fear and hope in equal measure. The trail toward Clearwater Junction stretched long and winding, the earth rising and falling beneath the horses' hooves like the slow breath of the land itself. The afternoon sun burned gently above them, its warmth softened by a drifting breeze that carried dust, sage, and the faint tang of pine from the distant foothills. Eleanor rode between Wesley and Thomas, her posture upright, though every muscle held a quiet tension. The uncertainty pressing against her ribs felt heavier with every mile. They spoke little as they traveled. The land did the talking for them, the rustle of dry grass, the soft clatter of loose stones under hoof, the distant call of a hawk circling high above. Eleanor found a sliver of comfort in the steady rhythm. It reminded her that the world kept moving, even as her heart battled the weight of unanswered questions. A few miles in, the trail narrowed as they entered the lower ridge. Jagged rock formations rose on either side, carved by years of wind and rain. The shadows deepened here, offering cool shelter from the sun. Wesley slowed his horse and glanced back at Eleanor. "You keeping steady?" he asked. She nodded, though her breath quivered faintly. "I'm managing." "Good. The ridge can get tricky. Stay close." Thomas guided his horse behind her. "If anything jumps out at us, it'll meet a boot before it reaches you." Eleanor managed a small smile. "I appreciate that." They rode deeper into the ridgeline. The silence grew sharper, as though waiting for something to stir. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the reins. Her mind drifted again toward Isaac, toward the pieces of him she'd held onto for so long. His letters, full of warmth and hope, the promises, the dreams. A life she had built in her imagination while waiting for him to send word again. And now, this. Was he really alive? Was he hurt? Had he chosen to leave everything behind, including her? The questions knotted inside her like tangled thread. Wesley slowed again, his voice lowering. "You're quiet." "I'm thinking," she murmured. "About him." "Yes." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he guided his horse a little closer, letting it walk beside hers. "The things we wait for in silence often hurt the most." Eleanor turned toward him slightly. "Is that something you learned from the land from life?" he replied. "From losing people, and waiting for news that doesn't come." Her breath hitched softly. "I didn't mean to bring trouble to your family." "You didn't," he said, the firmness in his voice surprising her. "You came here with hope. That's not trouble." She held his gaze, the honesty in his eyes stirring something warm inside her. She looked away before the feeling settled too deeply. An hour later, they reached a fork in the trail. One path led toward the river crossing, the other toward the abandoned quarry. Wesley halted and dismounted, crouching to study the ground. Thomas joined him, squinting at the dirt. "Tracks." "Maybe," Wesley murmured. "Boot prints, 2 sets, one older, one fresher." Eleanor watched them with her heart climbing higher into her throat. "Do they look like Isaac's?" Wesley glanced up at her. "Hard to say. The prints are worn by wind, but one set is lighter. Could be someone carrying less weight, or someone not eating well." Her stomach tightened. "Do we follow them?" Wesley hesitated. "They lead toward the quarry." "Not the safest place. I don't care about safe," Eleanor whispered. I need to know." He stood slowly, brushing dust from his hands. "Then we follow." They guided their horses toward the quarry entrance. The wind picked up, sweeping through the narrow pass with a low, echoing murmur. The abandoned buildings came into view, the skeletal remains of old mining sheds, their roofs sagging, boards splintered, rusted rails cut through patches of scrub, leading toward a cavern carved into the hillside. Eleanor shivered despite the sun. It feels empty. Thomas scanned the area, or watched. Wesley sighed quietly. "We stay alert." They dismounted and tied the horses to an old post. Wesley approached the entrance first. Eleanor followed closely, her pulse thudding in her ears. The cavern breathed cool air, carrying the metallic scent of old stone. Inside, shadows stretched far into the dark. Isaac Wesley's voice echoed through the hollow. "Isaac, you in here?" No answer. They stepped deeper. The cavern widened into a room once used for storing equipment. Dust coated everything in a thick, undisturbed layer except for a narrow path leading toward the back. Eleanor moved her lantern closer, its glow revealing footprints in the dirt. A different voice echoed behind them. "Seems you're looking for the missing Grant brother." Eleanor spun around. A figure stood in the entrance, a lean man with a rifle slung across his chest. His eyes narrowed with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Not a bandit, but not someone she recognized. Wesley shifted defensively. "Who are you?" "Name's Colton Hayes," he said. "Prospector. Been camping near the ridge these last weeks." His gaze flicked to Eleanor. "You must be the bride." Eleanor stiffened. "I am." Colton nodded once. "Then I reckon you're entitled to know what I saw." Wesley stepped forward. "What did you see?" Colton leaned against the cave wall, lowering his voice. "Saw a man matching Isaac Grant's description 2 nights back." He wasn't alone. Eleanor's breath caught sharply. Who was with him? A stranger. Tall. Wore a dark coat and kept close to him. They were arguing near the river. Didn't catch the words, but Isaac looked scared. The stranger pushed him. Hard. Wesley's jaw clenched. "Did Isaac get away?" "Don't know. I stayed hidden until they moved out of sight." Colton paused. But the stranger came back alone. Eleanor felt her knees weaken. Wesley reached out subtly, his hand hovering near her arm, steadying her without touching unless she needed it. Thomas's voice grew rough. "You follow him." "No." He disappeared into the ridge. "Don't know where he went." Wesley exhaled slowly, the weight of the revelation settling heavy over all 3 of them. So Isaac might be alive, or he might be lying hurt somewhere near the river. Colton watched them quietly. "If you plan on searching, be careful. Whoever that stranger was, he didn't look like a man who leaves loose ends behind." Eleanor's voice trembled. Why would anyone want to hurt him? Isaac never made enemies. Colton shrugged, sympathy threading through his tone. Sometimes trouble finds a man without him asking for it. Wesley stepped closer to Eleanor now, his presence a firm shelter. "We'll search the river next." Thomas nodded. "Before daylight fades." Eleanor swallowed hard, her voice barely steady. "We have to find him." Wesley met her eyes, and in that moment, something unspoken but strong moved between them. Not a promise, not yet, but a vow of effort, a vow of loyalty, a vow that whatever the truth was, she would not face it alone. "Eleanor," he said softly, "we will." They thanked Colton, then stepped back into the fading afternoon light. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the quarry. Eleanor felt them stretching toward her, cold fingers of uncertainty trying to coil around her resolve. Wesley touched her elbow lightly. "Breathe," he whispered. She did. Slowly, deeply. Then they mounted their horses again and turned toward the river trail, the quiet fear riding with them, the hope burning just enough to keep them moving. The descent toward the river stretched long and quiet, a path cut through layers of sandstone and wind-worn earth. Afternoon light softened into an amber haze, casting gentle warmth over the trail, but it did little to calm the unease building in Eleanor's chest. She rode close beside Wesley, her fingers gripping the reins with more tension than she intended. The thought of Isaac somewhere near the water hurt, frightened, or worse, gnawed at her with every breath. Wesley glanced toward her from time to time, reading her silence with the same care he used when approaching a skittish horse. He didn't speak, but the weight of his presence steadied her more than words could. Thomas rode behind them, scanning the hills, his posture coiled with wary alertness. Colton's warning echoed between them even though none of them repeated it aloud. A stranger, an argument, a man returning alone. The kind of detail that hollowed the heart. As they neared the river, the sound of running water drifted through the rocks, a soft, persistent murmur that grew stronger with each bend in the trail. Eleanor felt her pulse rise. The landscape opened suddenly, revealing the wide flow of the Clearwater River slipping over polished stones. Willows bent gracefully along the bank, their leaves catching light like thin silver threads. But there was something else, too. Something wrong. Wesley slowed his horse and lifted a hand for quiet. Eleanor's breath stalled as she followed his gaze. Near the waterline, marks scarred the earth heavy, deep imprints that had disturbed the soil. Wesley dismounted, his boots crunching lightly as he dropped to inspect the ground. Thomas joined him. Crouching low, Eleanor stayed in the saddle for a moment, fear holding her stiff. Then she slid down carefully and approached. Wesley brushed his fingers over the dirt. "Struggle marks," he murmured. "More than one person." Thomas nodded grimly. Somebody was dragged, boot prints leading toward the reeds. Eleanor felt the world tilt slightly. "Is it Isaac?" Wesley answered gently. "We don't know yet, but someone was here. Recently." He rose to his feet and walked toward the edge of the riverbank. The water glimmered under the fading sun. Bits of torn vegetation drifted lazily along the surface. A faint scrap of fabric fluttered from a low branch, dark, worn, and frayed. Eleanor stepped closer. "It's from a coat," Wesley said quietly. Her breath trembled. His Thomas examined it closely. Could be. Could also belong to someone else. Hard to tell. Eleanor closed her eyes for a beat, calming the trembling that threatened her balance. When she opened them again, Wesley's eyes were waiting for hers, offering steadiness without pity. "We'll look along the bank," he said, slow and careful. They began searching, staying close together. The river carried a cool, steady whisper that filled the pauses between their steps. Eleanor scanned the reeds, the stones, the narrow pockets of mud near the shore. Every shadow looked like a sign. Every shape tugged at the tight thread of fear inside her. After several long minutes, Wesley called softly, "Over here." Eleanor hurried toward him, Thomas close behind. Wesley knelt near a patch of disturbed ground. Half buried in the mud lay a tin button, small and tarnished, but etched with a familiar symbol. Her breath caught as she recognized it. "That's Isaac's," she whispered. He had that button sewn onto his coat before he left home. Wesley lifted it carefully. He was here. No doubt now. Thomas exhaled, heavy and troubled. What we don't know is whether he walked away or was taken. The air thickened with the weight of that uncertainty. Eleanor looked up the riverbank, her voice trembling. If he was dragged, then he couldn't have gotten far. Wesley stood slowly. "Let's follow the trail." They moved along the water's edge. The fading light turned the world into a wash of gold and shadow. Birds rustled in the trees, lifting into the sky in small clusters. The river widened in places, narrowed in others. Eleanor's heart pounded in the hollow of her throat. After a while, they reached a bend where the water cut deeper into the soil. The tracks grew scattered, as though someone had struggled near the edge. Wesley knelt again, scanning the ground with narrowed eyes. Eleanor stood still, her hands knotted in front of her. Then she noticed something half buried under a stone, a flash of metal. She crouched, lifted it with shaking fingers. Isaac's pocket knife. She recognized the small engraving on the handle, an old family mark Wesley once mentioned. Her vision blurred for a second. Wesley's voice lowered. "That's his." Eleanor's breath came shallow. "He wouldn't drop this willingly." Thomas stepped closer. No sign of blood. "That's something, but not enough," Eleanor whispered. An ache spread through her chest, heavy and deep. The knife felt cold in her palm, its weight pressing against the fragile hope she carried. Wesley reached out slowly. He didn't take the knife from her hand. He simply rested his fingers near hers, offering a quiet anchor. "We're not done searching," he said gently. "Whatever happened here didn't finish here." A breeze swept along the river, stirring the reeds. The sound of water grew louder, pressing into the silence between them. Eleanor steadied her breath. What if he's hurt somewhere further up the trail? What if he's waiting for help? Wesley met her gaze. Then we'll find him. His certainty didn't erase her fear, but it strengthened her resolve. She nodded, slipping the pocketknife into her shawl. They continued upstream. The terrain became rougher, the river carving sharper edges into the hillside. Twilight wrapped itself around the land, stretching shadows long and thin. Eleanor's anxiety flickered like an unsteady flame, but she kept moving, guided by determination and the steady presence of the men beside her. After another stretch of searching, they reached a narrow ravine where rocks jutted out sharply. The ground here bore deeper marks, signs of hurried steps, uneven and chaotic. A scuffle, a fall, something violent. Thomas inspected the dirt. Someone climbed up this slope. Slipped a few times. Eleanor's breath hitched. Was it him? Wesley studied the marks with a hunter's precision. Looks like only one set. Could be Isaac trying to get away. Eleanor's heart lifted. Fragile, but hopeful. Then he's alive. Wesley didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice held both caution and compassion. He was alive when he left this riverbank. That much is clear. She clutched the shawl tighter, grounding herself. As night approached, Thomas lit a lantern, its glow pushing back the gathering dark. They continued slowly along the ravine, scanning every inch of ground. The silence deepened around them, broken only by their careful footsteps and the distant murmur of the river. Then Eleanor stopped suddenly. A piece of cloth caught on a thorn, torn, dirty, but unmistakably from the lining of Isaac's coat. Her voice wavered. He came this way. Wesley stepped beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. We're on the right trail. She nodded, her throat tightening. We have to keep going. Wesley held her gaze with a quiet strength. We will, no matter how long it takes. The lantern light flickered across their faces, casting shifting shadows that made the ravine feel both intimate and vast. Eleanor felt her fear grow darker at the edges, but she also felt a small light hold steady within her, a light fed by the promise in Wesley's voice, by his calm beside her, by her own stubborn hope. They pressed onward, deeper into the night, the river fading behind them as the search carried them toward a truth that waited somewhere in the narrowing dark. Whatever they found next, it would change everything. Night settled over the ravine like a heavy blanket, thick enough to swallow the horizon. The lantern Thomas carried carved only a small circle of light ahead of them, its glow trembling with every gust of wind that swept through the narrow pass. Eleanor moved close beside Wesley, her steps careful on the uneven ground. The sharp scent of damp stone filled the air, mingling with the faint metallic whisper of fear she tried to hide. Wesley sensed it, though she spoke no word of it. His presence was steady as ever, quiet but certain, like an anchor cast deep where the current could not reach it. Each time the trail grew more difficult or the shadows crowded in too tightly, he slowed enough for her to catch her breath without needing to ask. The ravine twisted gradually, rising toward a higher ridge every few yards. Thomas lowered the lantern to check the ground for fresh disturbances. Eleanor watched the lantern light sweep across the earth, searching for a sign that Isaac had passed this way with purpose rather than despair. A few broken stones, a scuff where a boot had slipped, the faint imprint of weight pressed into softer dirt. Each clue kept her hope alive, though her chest tightened with each step. They reached a narrow ledge where the ravine pinched close. Wesley raised a hand for them to pause. Beneath the hush of the night, Eleanor heard something new. Not the river, now distant behind them, nor the wind threading through the crevices. The sound was softer, subtle, like a low murmur carried across the darkness. Wesley moved cautiously forward, motioning for Thomas to keep the lantern steady. Eleanor held her breath. A voice. Faint. Strained. Barely a whisper. Her heart stuttered. Isaac. She pushed ahead before she could stop herself, but Wesley stepped in front of her with gentle firmness. Stay behind me. We don't know what's ahead. Thomas lifted the lantern higher until the rocky curve of the ravine came into view. At first, Eleanor saw nothing but jagged stone and the shifting shadows cast by the flame. But then, tucked against the far wall, partly concealed by fallen log, a shape stirred. A man curled in on himself, unmoving save the shallow rise of breath. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, her breath breaking quietly. Wesley crossed the last few steps swiftly. He knelt beside the figure and rolled him gently onto his back. Thomas brought the lantern close. Eleanor sank to her knees as recognition washed over her. Isaac. His face was pale. Dirt streaked across his cheek. A bruise darkened one side of his jaw. His coat was torn, mud clinging to the sleeves. But his eyes opened at the sound of her gasp, slow and dazed, as though surfacing from deep water. "Ma'am," he whispered, barely audible. "You came." Relief crashed through Eleanor so sharply that her vision blurred. "Isaac, thank God. Are you hurt?" "Can you stand?" Isaac blinked, struggling to focus. I tried to get back. Didn't think I'd make it." Wesley's voice gentled. "You're safe now. Just breathe." Isaac swallowed hard, pain catching in his throat. There was a man, big fella, wanted money I didn't have. I told him to leave me be, but he struck me. I ran, slipped by the bank, lost my footing. Think I hit my head. Eleanor clenched her hands together and fighting the anger that rose like wildfire. "Why didn't you come home sooner? You should have sent word." Isaac lowered his gaze. "I didn't want to be a burden. Figured I'd manage." Wesley shared a look with Thomas, a knowing one, a tired one. The familiar kind of trouble men sometimes create by trying too hard to hide their own weakness. "We need to get him out of here," Thomas said quietly. "He shouldn't walk." "I can walk," Isaac whispered, attempting to rise. The moment he pushed his weight up, his leg buckled sharply, and he collapsed back into the dirt with a stifled cry. Wesley steadied him. "You're not walking anywhere until we look at that leg." Eleanor reached for Isaac's hand. "You don't have to prove anything. Let us help you." Her steady tone softened him. His shoulders loosened slightly, and he nodded. Thomas unrolled a small canvas kit he often carried for simple field injuries. When he examined Isaac's leg, his expression grew grave. Wesley noticed immediately. "How bad?" "Not broken," Thomas murmured, "but twisted hard. He won't stand on it tonight." Eleanor inhaled slowly, letting the truth settle. They were far from the ranch, the terrain unforgiving, night closing in thicker by the minute. Wesley's voice rose steady into the silence. "We'll carry him." Isaac tried to protest, but Wesley's firm glance ended it before it began. Thomas doused the lantern to save fuel, leaving only a small flame to guide them. Wesley lifted Isaac onto his back with practiced strength, bracing him carefully so his leg wouldn't twist again. Eleanor steadied Isaac from the side while Thomas moved ahead to scout the safer portions of the trail. The climb out of the ravine was slow, difficult, but steady. With each careful step, the night seemed to listen. The scrape of boots against stone. The rasp of Wesley's breath under the weight of his brother's son. The quiet encouragements Eleanor whispered when Isaac winced, every sound stitched into the fabric of the moment, raw and fragile but threaded with purpose. They reached the ridge near midnight. The land stretched wide under a sky heavy with stars. the moon lifting behind a bank of clouds. A cool wind swept across the open ground, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant pine. Isaac leaned his head against Wesley's shoulder, exhausted. "I didn't mean to bring trouble. Not after all you've done," Wesley responded softly. "Family isn't trouble. It's responsibility." The words held something more than duty, something deeper. Eleanor felt the echo of it in her chest. As they crossed the open field, Isaac stirred again, voice thin. "I heard him. That man. He said he'd be back." Thomas tensed, glancing over his shoulder. "Did you get a name?" "No. But he had a scar running from his ear to his chin. Looked angry even before he struck me." Wesley kept walking, his voice steady. "We'll deal with him if he returns. Your job right now is to heal." Eleanor stayed close to Isaac, offering comfort in the quiet moments. His breathing eased slowly, his fear settling into fatigue. The ranch lights finally came into view just past the next hill, glowing faint through the darkness like small beacons calling them home. Eleanor released a trembling breath, but even as relief washed through her, a new tension found its way into her thoughts. Isaac's safety was not the end of the storm, only the eye of it. A stranger with violent intent was somewhere out there, moving through the same land they called home, a threat lurking in the quiet, a shadow waiting for the right moment. Wesley seemed to sense her worry. His voice reached her softly as they approached the porch. "We're not finished with this, but he's back. That's what matters tonight." She nodded, though the unease lingered behind her ribs. The night had given them Isaac, but it had also delivered a warning, and the truth rarely came without a second edge. The house felt heavier that night, even after they carried Isaac inside and settled him in the small guest room near the kitchen. The walls seemed to hold their breath. Eleanor stayed at his bedside while Wesley fetched water and blankets. His movements steady, though she sensed a deeper current beneath his calm. Thomas heated a kettle over the fire and mixed a poultice the way he'd been taught years ago by an Apache healer along the southern trail. Isaac drifted in and out of sleep. Each time his eyes opened, they carried a mixture of confusion and shame, as though he could not quite accept that he hadn't been strong enough to make his own way home. Eleanor brushed his hair gently from his forehead and whispered encouragement until he slipped back into stillness. Past midnight, the wind rose, brushing the house with a low hum that sounded almost like a warning. The lantern flame quivered. Eleanor sat back, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. Wesley watched her from the doorway, a quiet concern settling into the lines of his face. "You should rest," he said softly. "I'll stay with him." She shook her head. "Not yet. I need to be here when he wakes." He stepped into the room, his boots whispering against the wooden floor. "Eleanor, you haven't slept since yesterday. Let me take over for a while." The gentle firmness in his voice made her chest warm, though she looked away before he could read too much in her eyes. But exhaustion had begun to seep into her bones, weaving through her like slow-moving water. She finally nodded. "All right," she murmured. "Wake me if anything changes." "I will." She rose carefully, touching Isaac's hand one last time before slipping out. Wesley eased into the chair beside the bed, the lamplight catching on the hard planes of his face. As Eleanor walked down the hall, she felt a pull toward him, a quiet gravity that had grown slowly, impossibly, through everything they had endured. The night deepened. The house creaked and sighed in the shifting wind, and the scent of sage drifted in through the cracks of the window frame. Eleanor reached her room and sank onto the bed without undressing, fatigue pressing into her like a weight she'd carried for years. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come quickly. Her mind circled back to the ravine, to the torn fabric on the thorn, to Isaac's voice trembling as he spoke of the stranger, the scar, the demand for money, the anger in the man's eyes, and, beneath all that, a sense that Isaac had left out something important. The thought tugged at her long after the rooms had grown still. Somewhere, close to dawn, she finally slipped into a fragile sleep, but the rest was thin, broken by flickers of memory and fear. When Thomas knocked on her door just as the sky lightened with the pale glow of morning, she woke with a start. "Eleanor," he called softly, "you should come." She hurried to Isaac's room. Wesley was still there, but now he looked as though he'd carried the weight of more than one night. Isaac lay awake, propped slightly by pillows. His eyes were clearer, though rimmed with fatigue. "You're up," Eleanor said, relief easing her voice. Isaac nodded faintly. "Didn't sleep much. Figured I owe you all the truth." Wesley exchanged a glance with Thomas, then pulled a chair closer. "Tell us what happened." Isaac's fingers trembled slightly as he gripped the blanket. "His name is Rowan Pike." Thomas's jaw tightened. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Wesley's expression darkened. "You're certain?" "Yes," Isaac whispered. "I recognized him after he struck me. He used to work with a cattle outfit near the New Mexico line. Heard he got thrown out for stealing from his own crew." Eleanor sank slowly into a chair. Something colder than fear slipped down her spine. "Why was he following you?" Isaac stared at his hands for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the heaviness of a secret that had worn him thin. "It's my fault," he said. "All of it. I saw him taking things that weren't his at the supply yard last month. Food, rope, a set of tools. When he caught me watching, he told me to keep quiet. I didn't. I told the owner. Rowan got fired the same day." Wesley's face hardened. "And he blamed you." Isaac nodded, shame pulling at his features. "He said he'd find me eventually. Said I'd regret opening my mouth." Thomas swallowed a curse. "A man like Rowan doesn't forget a grudge. He tracks it like blood." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice soft but resolute. "What did he want from you, revenge?" Isaac whispered. "Or fear? Maybe both. When he cornered me by the river, he said I ruined his life, that someone had to pay for that." Eleanor reached for Isaac's hand, feeling him tense before he softened slightly. "You didn't ruin anything. People choose their own path." His breath shook, and for a moment he looked years younger, burdened by guilt he didn't deserve. Thomas crossed his arms. "We need to tell the sheriff." Wesley nodded. "I'll ride into town after the sun's fully up. This can't wait." But Isaac's voice cut through the room. "No. Don't do that." Wesley turned toward him. "He attacked you. That's attempted murder. The sheriff needs to know." Isaac swallowed hard. "You don't understand. Rowan said if I told anyone, he'd come after all of you. And he meant it. He knows where the ranch is. He said he'd be back when I least expected it." Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. Wesley's eyes flickered toward her with protective instinct rising sharp and quiet. "That's exactly why we need to tell the sheriff," Wesley said. "This isn't a threat we can ignore." But Isaac shook his head, desperation rising. "Please, if he thinks I talked, he won't stop. I brought this trouble here. I won't bring more by provoking him." Wesley's jaw tightened. "You didn't bring anything here. He did." Thomas shifted his stance, looking between them. "We could keep watch. Rowan won't come storming in by daylight. He's a man who strikes from the shadows." Eleanor stood slowly. "This house doesn't survive on fear, and you don't have to carry this alone. Isaac, whatever he intends, we face it together." Her voice, quiet and steady, filled the room with a warmth that softened even the hardest edges. For the first time since they'd found him, Isaac's eyes shone with something other than fear. Respect, relief, gratitude. Wesley watched her with a look that lingered. Something shifted in his expression. A quiet acknowledgement of her strength, of her heart. of how naturally she stepped into the role of someone who carried others through storms. Isaac sank back into the pillows, exhausted, but calmer than before. Thomas covered him with a blanket, murmuring that he'd keep the fire going. Wesley walked Eleanor into the hallway, lowering his voice so Isaac wouldn't hear. "You were steady in there," he said, stronger than any man could have asked for. She lifted her gaze to his. "I just don't want fear to decide our next step." He nodded. "Neither do I." The moment stretched, soft as a held breath. A quiet understanding passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Then Wesley stepped back, letting the connection ease into silence. "We'll handle Rowan Pike," he said, "no matter what comes." Eleanor nodded, though a new worry settled beneath her ribs. The danger was no longer a distant shadow. It had a face, a name, a purpose, and it was coming. Morning spread slowly across the valley, filtering through a thin veil of mist that clung to the fields. The ranch, usually calm at first light, seemed unsettled in a way Eleanor felt deep in her bones. Even the horses shifted restlessly in their pens, tossing their heads as though they sensed the change in the air. Inside the kitchen, the quiet clatter of Thomas preparing coffee offered a small measure of normalcy. Eleanor sat at the table, hands wrapped around a warm mug she hadn't yet sipped. Wesley stood near the window, studying the horizon as though waiting for something to reveal itself. The early sun brushed a pale gold across his shoulders, but the tightness in his jaw told Eleanor his thoughts were far from peaceful. Isaac was resting, though each passing minute added to Eleanor's concern. She had checked on him twice already that morning, each time finding him breathing steadily, but haunted by the weight of what Rowan Pike's return could mean. Wesley finally turned from the window. "Tracks leading toward the east ridge," he said. "Fresh ones. Wasn't any there yesterday." Thomas set down the coffee pot. "Horse tracks. Boot prints," Wesley said quietly. "Deep ones. Someone moving with purpose." A chill slid down Eleanor's spine. "Do you think it's Rowan?" "Could be," Wesley answered. "Or someone he sent. Either way, we can't treat it lightly." She looked toward the hallway where Isaac rested. Her voice lowered. "He shouldn't wake to danger outside the window." Wesley stepped closer to her, his tone steady but gentle. "He won't. Not today." Something warm pressed behind Eleanor's ribs at his certainty, though the worry remained. "What are you planning to do? Scout the ridge," he said. "Quietly. Thomas can watch the house while I see if someone's lurking closer than we think." She hesitated. "I want to come." Wesley's answer was immediate. "No." Her breath caught. "Wesley, I'm not helpless. I've walked these hills. I've worked beside you for weeks. It's not a question of strength," he said softly. "Rowan Pike is dangerous. A man fueled by bitterness doesn't think the way others do." Eleanor held his gaze, the air between them thick with unspoken things. "I don't want to wait in fear." "I know," he murmured. "But if something happened to you—" He stopped. Words frayed. For a moment, emotion flickered across his face, raw and unguarded. Eleanor felt the meaning settle into her heart with a quiet ache. Thomas cleared his throat carefully, as if giving them room to step back from the precipice. "I'll keep watch from here. You check the ridge, and, Eleanor, maybe stay close today, just until we know more." Eleanor exhaled slowly. "Fine. But I won't be idle." Wesley nodded once, then grabbed his hat and stepped outside. The door closed gently behind him, but the silence he left behind made the house feel suddenly too large. She stood and moved to the basin, rinsing her cup with steady hands, though her thoughts churned like dark water. Isaac's trembling confession replayed in her mind. The threat, the promise of return, the sharp fear in his eyes. She could not shake the sense that Rowan Pike's shadow was already closer than they realized. An hour passed in slow, uneasy stretches. Thomas attended to chores near the barn, keeping the house in sight. Eleanor checked Isaac again, finding him awake and clearer than before. His voice was hoarse, but he managed a weak smile. "You should be resting," she said gently. "I've done enough lying still," he murmured. "Did Wesley go out?" She nodded. "Just to look around. Nothing more." Isaac swallowed, guilt darkening his eyes. "I didn't mean to put any of you in danger." "You didn't," she answered. "This isn't on your shoulders." His gaze drifted to the window. Rowan doesn't stop. Not when he wants something. What does he want? Now. Isaac hesitated. His fingers twisted lightly in the blanket. Not money. Not really. "I think he wants to prove he still has control. That losing his job didn't make him powerless." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Hurting you won't give him control. It only shows his desperation." Isaac blinked, his voice cracking. "He said he'd make me regret being honest." She touched his hand, her palm warm against his cold fingers. "Then he underestimates you." Isaac looked at her, something fragile easing in his expression. "You and Wesley. You didn't have to come for me, but you did." "We're family," she whispered. "Even when it's hard. Even when it scares us." He let out a small breath, shaky and soft. "I'm grateful. Truly." She stayed with him a few minutes longer before stepping back into the hallway. The quiet pressed heavier now. The air felt charged, as though the house itself was waiting. When the front door finally opened, Eleanor turned sharply. Wesley stepped inside, his expression more serious than before. Dust streaked his coat, and his eyes held a sharper alertness. Thomas entered from the back, crossing the room quickly. "What did you find?" Wesley removed his hat slowly, setting it on the table. "A campsite. Recent. Less than a mile from here. One man by the looks of it." Eleanor felt her breath thin. "Was it him?" Wesley nodded. "I saw the print of a boot heel with metal studs on the edge. Same kind of mark Isaac had near the ravine," Thomas muttered. "So he's watching." "Yes," Wesley said, "and waiting." The room fell into a tense hush. Eleanor forced herself to breathe evenly. "Did he see you?" "No," Wesley answered. "I stayed behind the higher rocks, but his fire was still warm. He can't be far." Thomas crossed his arms. "What do we do now?" Wesley turned toward Eleanor, his voice calm but weighted. "We tighten the perimeter. We keep Isaac inside, and we prepare in case Rowan tries something before nightfall." The thought made Eleanor's stomach clench. "Do you think he will?" Wesley's eyes softened, but the truth in them was firm. A man like Rowan doesn't sit still. If he means harm, he'll make a move soon. Eleanor's heartbeat pulsed like distant thunder. "Then we need a plan." Wesley nodded. "And we'll make one." She looked at him, really looked, and saw beneath the hardness of his expression the same quiet fear she carried. Fear not of Rowan Pike, but of losing the fragile safety they'd built together. Of losing each other. Wesley stepped closer, lowering his voice just for her. "I will protect this house. Protect you. That's a promise." Her breath trembled, not from fear, but from the depth in his words. A warmth spread through her chest, steadying her even as dread pressed heavier at the edges. Outside, the wind turned colder. Inside, their resolve grew sharper. Rowan Pike was near, and the next move he made would not be from the shadows. Evening shadows lengthened across the valley, settling over the ranch like a veil drawn tight. Eleanor felt each minute stretch thinner, pulled by a quiet dread that whispered through the walls of the house and curled under her skin. The fire crackled softly in the main room, but even its warmth could not push back the unease that circled the edges of her thoughts. Thomas checked the windows twice, making sure the latches were secured. Isaac rested in the guest room with a blanket pulled to his chest, still pale but more awake than earlier. Wesley stood at the front door, his shoulders outlined by the dim dusk light, watching the horizon with a sharpness that seemed carved from something harder than fear. Eleanor stepped toward him quietly. "You've been standing here a long time." Wesley didn't turn immediately. When he finally glanced at her, his voice was low. "Something's off. The woods are too still. Even the crickets have stopped." She felt the chill in his words settle inside her. "Do you think he's close?" "Yes," Wesley said simply. "I'd bet my life on it." Eleanor drew a long breath, steadying her nerves. "Then we stay ready." Wesley studied her for a moment, something soft pushing through the grimness in his eyes. "You've got more grit than half the men I've known." Her cheeks warmed, but she held his gaze. "I'm just tired of being afraid." He nodded slowly. "Fear's natural, but letting it decide things, that's different. You're not doing that." Silence stretched between them, deeper than before, threaded with something unspoken and fragile. Then Thomas stepped into the room, breaking the moment. "The perimeter's clear as far as I can tell," he said, "but the horses are restless." Wesley straightened. "If Rowan's planning something, the stock will sense him before we do." Thomas ran a hand across his jaw. "The mare bolted twice when I walked by. She's never done that." Eleanor's chest tightened. "He's watching us. He must be." Wesley exhaled slowly. "Then he's waiting for the right moment. Men like Rowan don't strike head-on. They go for the quiet moments, the soft edges, the moments when someone turned their back, when a house felt safest, when hope and vigilance tangled too closely. Night settled deeper. The sky turned a deep blue-black, pierced by a handful of bright stars. The moon hovered low, its glow faint, casting long shadows across the yard. Wesley lit 2 lanterns, placing one near the back door and keeping one for himself. Thomas prepared a rifle, checking the chamber with a quiet sniff of disapproval at the old mechanism. Eleanor felt helpless watching them arm themselves. She didn't want weapons. She wanted peace, wanted the threat to vanish with the day. But peace didn't come easy on the frontier, and the silence outside grew more unsettling with every passing second. "I need something to do," she finally said, her voice too soft at first. "Something that helps." Wesley turned toward her. "Stay with Isaac. Talk to him. Keep him calm." But she shook her head. "He's asleep now, and he doesn't want me hovering. I want to help the house feel alive, not scared." Wesley hesitated. "What did you have in mind?" "Light," she said. "Every window, every lamp. Make the house bright, make it clear we're awake." Thomas nodded. "That might spook Rowan. He's a man who likes shadows." Wesley finally agreed. "All right, I'll help. Together." They moved through the rooms, lighting each lantern and lamp. The warm glow spread across the floors and up the walls, painting the house with soft amber hues. The brightness lifted something inside Eleanor, a small reminder that fear didn't always have to dim everything. After the lights were set, the house felt less like a place waiting for danger and more like a place standing firm against it. Eleanor exhaled. Better. Thomas peered through a window. Maybe, but it also makes it easier for him to see us. Wesley gave him a pointed look. Let her feel the comfort. Don't smother it with practicality. Thomas huffed quietly. Didn't mean to. Just talking. Eleanor stepped closer to the window, feeling the rise and fall of her own breath calm. We're prepared. Whatever happens, we face it together. Wesley nodded once. Yes. Together. The word lingered between them. Then, a soft thud echoed from outside. Not loud, not sharp, but deliberate. Thomas stiffened. You heard that Wesley reached for the lantern. Stay behind me. Eleanor stayed rooted for a moment, hearing her own heartbeat pound like a drum. But she followed him to the door, staying one pace behind. Thomas took the rear, his steps silent. Wesley eased the door open just enough to slip outside. The night air hit them with a cold bite. The scent of sagebrush thickened. The moon hung low, barely bright enough to reveal the outline of the barn. Another sound. A scrape this time. Eleanor's breath hitched. Wesley signaled for silence. They moved toward the porch steps, lantern held close to Wesley's side to avoid casting too much light ahead. He took quiet, calculated strides. Then a figure moved near the barn. Eleanor's pulse lurched. A man stepped into the faint moonlight. Broad, heavy-set, wearing a dark coat and hat, a scar slicing from ear to chin, just as Isaac had described, Rowan Pike. He didn't flinch at the lantern. He stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes locked onto them with a cold, simmering fury. Wesley positioned himself in front of Eleanor without shifting his feet. Thomas lifted the rifle subtly, not pointing it yet, but ready. Rowan's voice rolled across the yard, low and gravel-edged. Took you long enough to come outside. Wesley stepped forward, keeping his tone flat. You need to leave. Rowan smiled, but it wasn't a smile. I came for the boy. Isaac is under this roof, Wesley said, and he's safe here. Safe. Rowan scoffed. You don't know what he cost me. Thomas lowered his rifle slightly, his voice steady as stone. He cost you a job because you stole. That's on you. Rowan's smile vanished. I didn't come for opinions. I came to settle a debt. Eleanor felt a surge of anger rise inside her, sharp and unexpected. She stepped forward before Wesley could stop her. Hurting him won't fix anything, she said, her voice steady though fear pounded through her. You're chasing a ghost of your own choices, not his. Rowan's eyes narrowed. You've got spirit. Shame it won't save you. Wesley moved subtly, shifting just enough to block Rowan's line of sight. You want a fight, you take it to me, not her. Rowan stepped forward, with pleasure. But before anything else could happen, Isaac's voice echoed from the doorway behind them. Thin but resolute. Rowan. Stop. They all turned. Isaac leaned against the doorframe, pale but standing, gripping the wood to keep himself upright. His voice trembled but carried strong enough to reach the yard. This ends tonight, Isaac said. You want to blame someone. Blame me. But leave them out of it. Rowan laughed. Cold and sharp. Look at you. Can't even stand straight. I'm standing enough. Isaac fired back. And I won't let you hurt them. Eleanor's breath stilled. Wesley stepped closer to Isaac, ready to catch him if he fell. Rowan took one step forward. Fine, he said. Then face me. But in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was Wesley. His voice cut hard through the tension. You're not touching him. Rowan stopped. Wesley's next words dropped like a steady weight in the quiet. If you want to challenge someone, challenge the man who's willing, not the man who's injured. I won't let you lay a hand on him. A storm of silence followed. Rowan's grin returned, ugly and expectant. Then stepped forward. He growled, and Wesley did. The yard fell into a hush so deep it seemed the earth itself was holding its breath. The distance between Wesley and Rowan closed to just a few paces, and in that narrow stretch of ground lay every unspoken fear Eleanor had tried to swallow since the moment Rowan Pike's name first entered their lives. The cold air clung to her skin. The lantern near the door flickered against the wind. Isaac leaned heavily against the frame, struggling to remain upright, and Thomas positioned himself just off Wesley's shoulder, ready but waiting for Wesley's lead. Wesley stood tall, steady, unshaken. Rowan rolled his shoulders once as though limbering up for a fight he had practiced in his mind 100 times. His eyes glinted with a mixture of bitterness and eagerness, the look of a man who had shaped his entire purpose around vengeance. "You should have stayed inside," Rowan growled. "This isn't your battle." Wesley's voice came calm, low. "It became my battle the moment you stepped onto this land." Rowan smirked. "You're bold. Shame it won't help you." Wesley didn't lift a weapon, didn't clench his fists. Instead, he took one quiet step forward, grounding himself in a calm that contrasted sharply with Rowan's restless fury. "You're angry because you lost control of your life," Wesley said. "But you won't get it back by crushing someone else." Rowan barked out a humorless laugh. "You think this is about control? I know it is," Wesley replied. "A man who steals from his own crew isn't looking for justice. He's looking for someone to blame." Rowan's face twitched, something ugly surfacing. "You talk like you know men like me." "I do," Wesley said softly. "I've seen them break under their own choices." For a moment, the world seemed to shrink around Rowan, compressing his rage until it throbbed at the edges of his breath. He took another step forward. "Enough of your pretty speeches," Rowan snapped. "You stand in the way. I'll shove you aside." Wesley didn't move. "You won't get past me," he said. Rowan lunged. Eleanor gasped, instinctively reaching out as though she could pull the moment back. But Wesley met Rowan's charge with an unexpected calm. He sidestepped, catching Rowan's arm and twisting it just enough to break the momentum. Rowan stumbled, boots scraping across the dirt. He spun back with a snarl. "You think you're clever?" Rowan spat. "No," Wesley said quietly. "Just steady." Rowan struck again, this time with clenched fists. Wesley dodged one blow, absorbed another to the shoulder, then planted his feet firmly. Thomas moved forward, but Wesley signaled sharply behind his back. "Stay back," he murmured. "This isn't how I'd handle it," Thomas whispered. "It is tonight." Wesley answered. Rowan came at him a third time, more reckless, more furious. Wesley blocked the strike and shoved him backward, not with violence but with the force of someone who refused to give ground. Rowan staggered, breath coming in harsh bursts. "You keep pushing me," Rowan snarled. "You think you're winning. There's nothing to win," Wesley said. "Just something to end." Eleanor felt her heart twist painfully. Wesley's restraint wasn't weakness. It was something else entirely. Something anchored deep, shaped by grief he rarely spoke of, by a promise he carried quietly, by a sense of right that didn't shout but held firm. Rowan wiped blood from his lip and glanced at Isaac. His voice dropped to a chilling tone. "He ruined my life," Rowan hissed. "And you all protect him. You're fools." Isaac straightened painfully. "I told the truth. That's all." Rowan's eyes flashed. "Your truth cost me everything. Your choices cost you everything." Isaac's voice cracked but carried strength. "You stole. You lied. You blamed everyone but yourself." Eleanor placed a hand on Isaac's arm to steady him, but she didn't stop him from speaking. He needed this moment as much as Rowan feared it. Rowan sneered. "Save your breath. Boy, I'm not interested in your guilt." Wesley stepped between them again. "Then be interested in mine." Rowan blinked. "But I was the one who brought him here," Wesley said. "I took responsibility for him. If you're set on hurting someone, then hurt me." Eleanor's breath froze. "Wesley, no." But Wesley didn't turn. His voice remained even, calm. "You want to fight. You want someone to lash out and I'm right here." He paused. "But you won't cross me. Not because you can't, but because deep down, you know this isn't about Isaac. It's about you being ashamed of the man you've become." Those words hit Rowan like a blow. His expression twisted with something Eleanor couldn't name. Rage. Yes, but beneath it a flicker of fear, a crack in the armor he hid behind. "You don't know anything about me," Rowan growled. "I know enough," Wesley said. "Enough to see you're standing at a crossroads, and the only thing waiting on the path you're on is a noose or a grave." Rowan's breath grew uneven. For the first time, he faltered. A long silence followed. The night seemed to listen. The horses stilled. Even the wind paused. Then Rowan spoke. Voice softer than before, almost hollow. "There's nothing left for me either way." "There is," Wesley said. "Walk away. Today. Right now. Before this becomes something you can't undo." Rowan's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked to Thomas's rifle, to Isaac's trembling stance, to Eleanor's steady gaze, then back to Wesley. "You'd let me go?" he asked. Wesley nodded once. "If you leave now and don't look back." Rowan stood there, breathing hard. Something shifted in him, not redemption, not remorse, but a tiredness that came from a long, bitter fight with life itself. He spat into the dirt, wiped his mouth, then stepped backward. One step, another. His gaze never left Wesley's. "You're a fool," Rowan muttered. "World doesn't reward mercy." Wesley's voice dropped like quiet thunder. "Maybe not, but I don't answer to the world." Rowan hesitated one last time. Then he turned and walked into the darkness, swallowed by the night he came from. The yard remained tense long after he disappeared. Thomas lowered the rifle slowly. "We'll keep watch till morning," he said softly. Wesley nodded, though his shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of what almost happened settling deep. Isaac exhaled shakily. "Thank you. I don't deserve Wesley cut him off with a shake of his head." "Stop. You deserve protection same as anyone." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling from relief and emotion. "Wesley, you could have been killed." He finally turned to her, and in his eyes she saw the truth she'd long suspected, but never dared claim. "I wasn't thinking about dying," he said softly. "I was thinking about keeping you safe." The words struck her deep, warm, and frightening. For a long moment, they held each other's gaze. The fear they had weathered together settled into something quieter, an understanding that felt like a promise neither had spoken yet. Isaac sank weakly into Thomas's support, and the two men led him back inside. Wesley stayed with Eleanor on the porch. The lantern glowed gently at their feet. The sky stretched wide above them, clear now, as though the storm had passed. Eleanor stepped closer. "You didn't have to risk yourself." Wesley looked down at her, voice low but certain. "I did, because some things are worth standing your ground for." Her breath trembled, such as his eyes softened. "You." The night finally exhaled, and Eleanor felt something inside her begin to mend something she once thought would stay broken forever. Eleanor and Wesley's story reminds us that life rarely goes in a straight line. Loss can knock us down, but it also opens up opportunities for us to look back at ourselves, to heal hidden corners that have long been silent. No one is too late to start over. No one is too old to find new peace. What makes people strong is not falling, but daring to stand up with a heart that still knows how to love. At any age, we all need gentleness, from others and from ourselves. And sometimes, a person's silence can also be the warmest words and affirmation that they are still with us, despite the storm. Thank you, especially those aged 60 and over, for accompanying the story. If this story touches a small corner of your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel, so that each week we can meet again on a new journey, gentle, profound, and full of hope.